Hello, everyone, and welcome to this WSET Bitesize webinar on why are some wines sweet. So before we get into the main body of the presentation, just a couple of things I'd like to point out. So firstly, this webinar, along with all of our Bitesize webinars, will be available on our Global Events Hub on YouTube. So it will be being recorded, and a copy of this will be emailed to all participants who are joining us live this morning. So my name is Rob Crouch. I am a business development manager with the EMEA team here at WSET. I've been around now for about 4.5 years working with the business development team. And I'm sure that a lot of you will already know who WSET are and what we do. But for those who may be new to us or joining for the first time with one of our webinars, WSET is the world's largest and leading provider of qualifications in the wine, spirit and sake area. We've been running these courses for well over 50 years. 50 years was our in 2019, so we're kind of getting towards 55 years now, and we run them over increasing difficulty levels. So level 1 being beginner level and people who are potentially brand new to the topics of wine, spirits or sake, right through to level 3 for spirits and sake, and level 4 for wine, which is the diploma level, and therefore internationally recognized experts. So I'm about to start the presentation on why are some wines sweet, but I just wanted to give you a bit of an insight as to why I've chosen this particular topic to talk to you about today. I just love sweet wine. I think sweet wine is a style which these days is probably waning slightly in popularity, and I just think more people should try sweet wine. I love it, and if you haven't had some of the styles that we're going to talk about, I would really recommend giving them a try. So before we really can get into the main body of sweet wines and the production styles, I wanted to cover off 2 questions which I think are fundamental really to all wine, but it will really help us understand some of the concepts and some of the processes behind some of the sweet wines that we're going to talk about. So firstly, the simple question is, what happens during fermentation? So as you can see here in this very nice and easy equation, when sugar and yeast come together, the byproduct that is created is alcohol and carbon dioxide. So how this works, and this is the same whether we're fermenting grapes or must in this instance, or any alcoholic product at all. Yeast eats sugar. It needs it to survive. And so therefore any sugary liquid, any sweet liquid can in theory be fermented. And what that does is, as it eats the sugar, it produces that alcohol as the byproduct. So when the yeast has gone through this process, and when there is no longer enough sugar left in that liquid, fairly obviously self-explanatory, the wine will become dry and it will be full strength because there is no longer the sugar there, so that makes it drier. But the yeast has converted that sugar into alcohol, and so therefore the alcohol becomes slightly higher. And then the second area that I think is really important that we all understand in terms of going into sweet wines and talking more about them is, what is a grape? Now, of course, everybody joining this, I'm sure, will be familiar with what a grape is. But when we look behind the skin, as it were, and into the middle, we can look at a few areas. So firstly, the pulp, which is that behind the skin green part that you can see on the screen there. It's comprised largely of 3 things, so water, sugar and acids. And in order to create the perception of heightened sweetness or concentrate that sweetness, we need to reduce the water content in the grape itself. And as well as concentrating, obviously, the sweetness as the water dissipates, this also intensifies both the sweetness and also the acidity in that grape. Because I always like to use the analogy, if you have 2 glasses of water, one is full, one is half full, and you put the same amount of sugar into both, quite clearly the glass with less water in will be a sweeter liquid, because the ratio liquid to sugar is obviously higher. And I know that these seem really basic and obvious concepts, but I think it's really important just to step away from the wine world and really just understand it from a very basic point. So let's talk about a few different wine production methods. The first one I want to talk about today is the process of stopping that fermentation early. So again, if we think back to that first question that we looked at previously, we remember that the yeast is there busy eating the sugar and creating alcohol. And as that carries on producing the alcohol, it is eating away at that sugar. And by stopping this fermentation early, therefore, we will create that sweeter must or wine as it comes out the other side, but it will have a lower alcohol content because the yeast has not been able to finish its job, which is to convert all of that sugar into alcohol. A few things to point out as we go through these production styles and some of the stylistic choices that winemakers have. There are going to be a fair variety of different styles. So it's important to remember with ending fermentation early, generally speaking, this will create a lighter bodied wine style. So pretty light and easy going in terms of in the mouthfeel. And there are 2 common ways to achieve this. Now, the first one I'm going to touch on very briefly, which is fortification. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail with fortification because I believe that we will be hosting another bite-sized webinar going into much more detail around that. But essentially, if you look at a sweet wine like port, which, as you'll be aware, I'm sure it's fortified and also fairly high in alcohol. Essentially, what's done there is the fermentation of the original base wine is stopped relatively early on, so that the liquid is still very, very sweet. But the process of stopping it is actually to add a different alcohol, so a fully formed grape spirit in the case of port, which essentially kills that yeast off. So whilst the liquid remains sweet, the alcohol is brought up. So that's one method. The second one, which I think is more common for the sweet wines that we're talking about, and certainly the sweet wines which are table wine as opposed to fortified wine, is temperature control. And you can see here with this fermentation vessel that I have on the screen, these days we are talking about modern equipment and the ability to control temperature is very easy. Historically, it was more of a challenge, but now essentially what you can do is chill that must right down. You don't want to freeze it, doesn't need to be ice cold, but if you chill it really down, what that essentially does is sends the yeast into some form of hibernation. So it stops eating that sugar, stops the process. And actually, in many cases, that yeast can then be collected afterwards and reused for different wines and different purposes. I just wanted to leave the fermentation early slide with a simple tip based on what we've just talked about. Now, it's not always the case. As with nearly everything in wine, there is very rarely something which is completely set in stone. But I think a really good tip, if you are new to wine and you want to try some of these styles, if you find a wine in a shop or a supermarket which has got a low ABV, so maybe 10% or lower, there's a really good chance that this process has been used here. And therefore, if it's below 10%, the likelihood is it's probably going to have a fair amount of residual sugar left in that liquid. So if you're unsure about it, but you want to try some sweeter styles, this is a really simple tip that can be used. And in terms of wines, I'm sure we'll all be familiar with, that you may have come across many times that have used this method. White Zinfandel is often made by ending fermentation slightly earlier, which I'm sure, if you're aware of that style, has that sweetness, that kind of sweet strawberry taste to it. Okay, the next area that I want to run through is late harvested grapes. So now we're going away from that question number one, if we think back to that original question slide, and now we're looking more at that process of reducing the water content in the grapes. So late harvested grapes, fairly self-explanatory. These are grapes which are harvested late. But the key thing here, again, if we think back to that first question, the grapes have fully ripened and then they're left out, and over the period of time, they start to shrivel. So this is, if you imagine, after the summer and we're moving into the autumn, they begin to shrivel. And I'm sure anybody who has seen apples left out on an apple tree into autumn can relate to this. They start to look shriveled in. But what that's actually doing, again, via transpiration, the water level is reducing, and therefore that sweetness and those extra ripe flavors start to develop. So you start to go from kind of stone fruit flavors through the scale into more tropical, and you start to pick up some really interesting dried fruit notes as well on these wines. And that is purely because, as we saw previously, that flavor profile really starts to be concentrated. This requires a dry autumn, simply because if you have a lot of humidity in a very damp, wet autumn, it becomes a breeding ground for fungal diseases, which we will touch on slightly later, but it can create a fairly disastrous fungal disease known as grey rot, which produces some really off flavors to the wine and would be no good for anybody. So it's something that it requires that dry autumn so that they can be left fairly low maintenance on those vines to be able to do their thing and shrivel. And as opposed to the previous slide, we were on the lighter side, these are more medium plus bodies. So that residual sugar is starting to create that mouthfeel and more body. And in terms of some labeling terms, if you are again wanting to try these styles, fairly obviously late harvest is seen in a lot of the English speaking world on wines of this nature. But within France, Alsace is an area that springs to mind immediately. Vendange tardif is the term for late harvest. And in the German speaking world, so Germany and Austria, is Spätlesen would be, again, same concept, late harvest grapes, but these are just the different terms. So if you see any of those terms on a bottle, that's what they mean, and you can try this. And as I say, I would encourage you to try a range of different styles as we go through this presentation. The second area, now this is in theory fairly straightforward and similar in concept to late harvest. We are allowing the grapes to start to raisin and start to shrivel. The key difference here is that these grapes are picked when still healthy, and then they are subsequently dried off the vine. So if you look at certain areas in southern Europe, so southern Italy and Spain in particular, these are often simply left out to dry in the sun. The climate is so dry and the humidity is so low that the risk of disease at that point is fairly minimal, and therefore those certain areas are able to dry those out and really concentrate that flavour, as we discovered previously with the shrivelling of the grapes. These grapes that you're looking at here on the screen are more likely to be from Valpolicella, where they are put into these wooden baskets essentially and moved into drying rooms or drying lofts within the winery, which are carefully controlled for humidity for exactly the same reason, because you really need to avoid any humidity which could cause disease. And again, as with before, now we are getting towards that really rich, full-bodied style. Gone are the sort of lighter elements. These are really wines that sort of pack a punch, and you can really get that mouthfeel. And some of the most famous wines that you will see, or certainly the most famous sweet wines that you will see from this style, would be the Valpolicella Recchiotto and Vinsanto, which, again, if you see them and you want to give this style a try, please do. A drier style famous for this is also Amarone, but I'm not going to talk too much about that today, because that is obviously not what we would traditionally call a sweet wine. And then finally, on terms on the bottles, because I know it's always really, for people who are beginning and getting into this, it's really interesting to see some terms. So a passimento or passito are the two terms that will signify this process has happened. So a passimento is the process itself, so that is the drying process, whereas passito is the wine or the resulting wine made from the appassimento. So passito wines have been made using the appassimento method, but essentially either of those two terms mean the same thing, and that means that they've been dried off the grape, off the vine rather. Botrytis wines. So we talked previously about fungal diseases and grey rot in particular, something that I mentioned. Botrytis is quite an interesting concept to get your head around, really, because botrytis and grey rot are essentially the same fungal strain. They are the same disease. However, botrytis or noble rot, as it's often referred to, is essentially when these conditions, weather conditions wise, are able to create a favourable take on the wine. So for this to work, we need very, very specific weather conditions. We need that dampness, humidity, maybe mist in the morning, but then that must be followed by a very dry afternoon. And what essentially that does is allows the fungus to come alive or to attack the grapes, but then that dry afternoon stops it from developing or overdeveloping to the point where it would cause grey rot. And what this essentially does is starts again rot those grapes, as you can see very clearly on these fairly manky looking grapes here that have been affected by botrytis. Again, shriveled in, the water is being evaporated by the fungus, which has pierced the skin in microscopic holes. And this creates a very, very unique set of flavors. Things that people often talk about would be ginger, honey, zest and orange peel, that sort of thing. But for me, marmalade, which I've got here on the slide, marmalade is the most unique and the one that always jumps out the glass at me, whenever I'm tasting botrytis wines, or if you're trying a flight of sweet wines blind. I always find that marmalade characteristic is so present that it becomes fairly straightforward and obvious that it's a botrytis style. So again, these are rich and full-bodied. As with before, we are very much in that full-bodied area. And some of the classic wines that you will see here, Sautern, Trockenbeerenau Schleser in Germany, and Tokai in Hungary. And finally, these set of weather conditions are so unique that in some regions, noble rot botrytis is not guaranteed every year. It's just not possible. If they have a really good year for these conditions, and absolutely they can make some fantastic wines, but there are years when they can make very little or even none at all. And this all gives you that insight into why these wines are so highly prized, so prestigious, and ultimately cost so much to buy, because this is a very, very difficult, naturally occurring process, which the winemakers have to be very, very skilled to be able to perform. It's a very fine line at times between botrytis and grey grey rot. So very, very difficult to make, not guaranteed, and that's why all of that labour tends to add to the prestige and cost. And then the final style that I want to go through today is ice wine or ice wine, depending on where you are. So ice wine, clearly the again Germanic influence. You'll see at the bottom of the slide there that the countries that make these wines or probably make them the most important in terms of these wines, they are made all over really, or certainly in those cooler areas clearly. But Canada, Austria and Germany tend to be the three biggest and most important producers of ice wine. And again, very simple. In theory, we're separating that water to concentrate the sweetness, but this time we're separating the water via freezing. So the distinction really between this and some of the other styles that we've been through is these grapes absolutely must be healthy. Any form of decay or rot or disease before this process would just not work. It would really concentrate those off flavors. So it is very, very important that we keep them out nice and healthy, and then they must be left out all autumn and into winter. The best wines tend to be picked very late in winter, so even as far as the end of January. So they have to be frozen, they have to remain healthy, and for that reason, they're only really used with very thick skin, hardy varieties. Anything with thin skins is going to be too prone to disease, too prone to the various natural environments which can affect the grapes. And so, yes, they keep all the way through the winter. And essentially, when they are pressed, that separates the ice from the pulp, from the juice. For this reason, as you can imagine, a frozen grape, the amount of juice that comes out of that is incredibly concentrated. They are very, very low yield, and again, really full-bodied. It's also worth talking with ice wine about some of the considerable risks that are present. We've already discussed disease and fungus and various infections of that nature. But clearly, if you're going to be leaving perfectly healthy grapes out all through that autumn and into winter period, they're also become natural pests. Birds, you can clearly see on the picture that we are using here, that there are bird netting being used. This is to keep away those birds and keep away any other pests which could eat the grapes. Any of these grapes which have been damaged in any way cannot be used at the end of the winter, because obviously as soon as the skins are split, that leads them open to all sorts of other diseases. So it's really, really difficult process, making sure that these grapes remain healthy and frozen all through that period. And again, as we've discussed before, this contributes to the yield being very low. The labor, the physical labor in the vineyard is very high, and all of these add to those costs and exclusivity of the wine style and the low yields. So this is again a very sought after, highly prized style of wine, which it ultimately is expensive because it's such a premium quality product. And we already talked through the countries that make some of these wines, so we'll move on. So hopefully that's a really good intro into some of the styles that we see with dessert wines and sweet wines. I'm going to go for a very sort of broad food and wine pairing now. I think that, and we teach at WSET, that food and wine pairing is unique, it's very individual, and there's no one rule fits all here. So the first thing to cover off really is that dessert wines and sweet wines, you want these well chilled as opposed to lightly chilled or obviously at room temperature. And the reason for that, I think, is because that coldness, these wines are intense, they're concentrated, they leap out of the glass at you, and I think that well-chilled factor makes them more enjoyable, but it also suppresses some of that really strong characteristics. So really nice and cold is the best way to drink these wines. I've then put in, talking about why, the food and wine pairing isn't necessarily, there are no rules, but there's no escaping the fact that sweet wines are often referred to as dessert wines or pudding wines in the UK in particular. So why desserts? Well, if you've ever tried a really sweet piece of dessert, cake, Christmas pudding, as I've got on the slide there, and you give it a good chew and kind of coat your mouth with that sweetness, and then taste something like a dry white, I don't know, Sauvignon Blanc from the Loire or New Zealand or wherever, you will really feel that kind of almost bitterness, the kind of acidity, kind of knocks the fruit out of balance a little bit. And do try that next time you've got a dessert and dry white wine, and sort of see how you feel. But with dessert wine, you're talking about wine which is as sweet as the pudding itself, or as a dessert. And what this does is essentially slightly softens both the dessert and the wine, takes the edge off that sweetness, so that rather than drinking a super sweet wine, the dessert softens it slightly and makes it even more palatable, and those flavors become even more expressive, and the kind of lusciousness, the sugar becomes less noticeable. And then finally, some food pairings. So as I say, I have got Christmas pudding here. I think it's brilliant time of the year to try dessert wines, open a bottle when you've got lots of people around a table. You can just tell, even in that very small picture, the richness of Christmas pudding. There is so much, and anyone who's ever made it, with the amount of fruit and nuts and sweetness that goes into that, is a really rich dessert, and it really needs a wine partner which is equally as sweet, for the reasons that I've given. And then finally, possibly slightly different, which is why I wanted to include it, this is Roquefort blue cheese, but any kind of salty cheese, salty blue cheese, has the same concept here, and that is basically that the salt in the cheese is balanced really well by that sweetness, and the sweetness takes from the saltiness, and they balance each other out really well and kind of marry together. And again, it softens both the wine and also the saltiness of the cheese. And that's what really food pairing is all about. It's all about understanding what is going on with the wine, and also what is going on with the food at the same time, and how they balance together, and what characteristics each have. And that's why, it's so important when you are eating to use something which goes with your own palate and how your taste works. Brilliant. So thank you so much for listening to me today. Hopefully you've learned a little bit more about sweet wines, or if you're already aware of sweet wines, this was a nice recap for you. I am going to take any questions in just a couple of minutes, but just before that, just wanted to run through again, mentioning that this will be recorded and put out onto YouTube, so you can revisit it or share it with people who you think might be interested. And in the meantime, if you have liked any of these, it's given you that kind of idea of wanting to learn more or taste some more of these sweet wines and try some styles you perhaps not had before, please do visit our Where to Study page on our WSET Global website. You simply put in your own postcode and it spits out all of your local providers. And our courses are fantastic, even if I do say so myself. But our course providers locally are also fantastic, and there are so many really knowledgeable people out there. So do give that a look. And thanks ever so much for your participation. And we are going to go to some Q&A. Bear with me 1 second. So if you do have any questions, now's the time to send those in. So the first one we've got is when we discuss about drying the grapes off the vine. I imagine the amount of time to be left drying would depend on the grape and style of the wine, but as a rough estimate, how long are they left drying after harvesting? So yeah, really, really good question. Ultimately, as you've pointed out in the question there is very much, quite a large variation here with how long this process, it can be days or it can be months. I would say somewhere in between that, generally a month, 6 weeks, something like that is a rough guess of how often, how long these happen for. But like you point out there, it's very much dependent on the winemaker, the wine style that they are looking to create, and ultimately how intense that is. And equally, if to state the obvious, if you're in the process of sun drying a batch of grapes and it starts to rain or there's unseasonable weather, that's going to create exactly the wrong conditions. So I don't think even necessarily, unless they're using humidifying rooms, that there is often, it is very much a case of seeing what the conditions are like beforehand. But yeah, thanks for the question. There's also another question around dessert wines and how they, or sweet wines, and how they age. So just to have a quick answer to that one. So it's a bit of a difficult one because that's stopping the fermentation early. Clearly, those wines are probably not going to age very long. I'm not going to recommend that you try to age White Zinfandel anytime soon, for example. But when we're talking about those more concentrated, full-bodied styles, absolutely, they've got the body, they've got the concentration of flavour and intensity, and they've got the acidity, which is also concentrated, as we've discussed. So all of those things mean that will enable a really decent aging time where those flavours will continue to develop and continue to concentrate, and possibly some of the more fresh or tropically flavours start to go more into that dry fruit characteristics and flavour. I think we've got time for one more question, maybe. So how is climate change going to affect some of the processes? Again, really good question. I think the short answer, I suppose, is we don't really know. But as with many wine producers and growers all over the world, climate change is a huge topic of discussion at the moment. And clearly, we've talked about some very unique climate and climatic factors here. And yeah, we know that as things change, so will the weather and the climates of these areas. So ice wine, for example, it's going to be, I would suspect, quite a long time before it becomes impossible in some of these places that are currently freezing grapes. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting, and lots of winemakers and growers all over the world are actively planning for this sort of for these sorts of eventualities, and how it is going to affect them and how they can recreate certain climatic things. Because ultimately, if botrytis stops being possible in the likes of Tokai, for example, that's going to be devastating, at least the Tokai sweet wine industry. So brilliant, thanks for the questions. I think that's probably all we've got time for. I think there are a few more questions in the Q&A, so we will try to get to those at some point soon. But in the meantime, just to point out, there is a poll there. Please do give us feedback on how you found the session, and hopefully we'll look forward to seeing you all at one of our courses soon. Many thanks. Bye-bye.